Hello, beautiful community. Let's give a go to making sense of the latest mess that the Russians have come up with. So, Russian soldiers have threatened a Russian lawmaker. And I want us to take a brief look at this sideways and then make a few judgments about how the Putin regime is traveling, how it's trying to reform itself, and what its current level of stability is. So I'm going to give you in my translation. What happens is a chat video, so please forgive me for not showing you footage and pictures. So I've got it here. A bunch of Russian soldiers from the Ulyanovsk region released a statement saying, we're not having a good time, we're not getting the supplies we want, we're not getting enough food, we're not getting enough water, we want to quit and join Wagner instead. Now that statement appeared, and then Mr. Viktor Sobolev, who is a Communist Party Duma member and also an ex-army general, responded. He said, oh, by the way, the Communist Party, if you want some cartoonish guide to it, is to be thought of as a government department. So when members of the Communist Party, in the Duma in Russia speak, think of that as somebody who is doing a kind of task for the Putin regime. Interestingly, though, if you put me up against the wall, let's say a few years ago, 3 years ago, and said, what are the political organizations in Russia that look most like political parties? I would say perhaps number one is Mr. Navalny's organization, right? It had sufficient grassroots sort of tentacle reach across the country with lots of bases and offices. And the other one might be the Communist Party. Aside, into the story. Mr. Sobolev said, this is my translation that I did in 2 seconds, so it's not perfect, but it completely gives you the sense. It isn't clear where the Wagner group is registered or what it does. And then the longer version. A private military company is an unlawful military organization. It's not clear where it's registered and what it does. I believe that a state such as Russia must possess an absolute monopoly over the formation, development and use of military force. There can be no private military companies. There is a law stipulating a 10 to 15 year prison sentence for leaving the army when you're at the front, like the guys in the video are trying to do. After Mr. Sobolev's statement, Mr. Prigozhin came in. Mr. Prigozhin is a very colorful communicator. So he said, Comrade Sobolev needs to be tested for anti-Russian dysentery. And then he addressed Mr. Sobolev and said, you beep made out of carton. Gather your beep and drag yourself to the front to show us what you are made of, you brainless gossiper. To which Mr. Sobolev then replied by, without swear words, restating his original position. Wagner shouldn't exist. Then there followed a video with 3 soldiers, 2 of them Wagner, but maybe all 3 of them are Wagner. I'm not sure about that detail. One of them is an ex-prisoner. And they, on behalf of Wagner, addressed, again, this communist Duma member, Mr. Sobolev. We want to say to Deputy Sobolev, if you beep, continue to shove your nose in matters that shouldn't be your concern, and the country, because of beeps like you, loses the war, we will be forced to go to Red Square and, in order to defend our people, to beep you and others like you in the beep. So you can see what a mellifluously functional state Russia is. So let's say a little bit about this. Let's put aside something we've already discussed and we might discuss again, which is morale. And here we should put aside just because it's all obvious to you, right? You're a Russian soldier, all of that is going on. So you have questions. Who's in charge of you? Who is legitimately versus illegitimately in charge of you? Who's right in these squabbles? Who do you represent? Is this what it seems to be? Or are the reasons for these conflicts hidden from view? Or are there no reasons for these conflicts and they're things that are acted out? So, as a soldier with this stuff going on, you cannot visualize a hierarchy of power, let alone a hierarchy of authority, that is coherent in a kind of instinctive, immediate sense. As soon as you begin to think, well, what am I doing here? Who am I doing this for? And why? And what's this sort of chain of command look like? And what does it look like at the very top? You can't get any clear images about any of this. It's just questions and debates, presumably you could have with fellow soldiers, which bit of the military do you side with? Is it that bit that's trying to get rid of this bit, or is it this bit that's trying to get rid of that bit? So putting this aside, right, the obvious consequences for morale, I think the way to take this kind of extraordinary stuff that we've just read out is in terms of a kind of semi-reluctant reformatting that the Putinite state is going through. Now, the Putin regime actually wanted to reformat itself before the war began. And one of the causes of the war is Putin's desire to reformat the state and take a series of totalitarian turns. This is a cartoonish term we've been using for many months. Which would be necessary for the stability of the regime, but would not be possible in peacetime. So there is a story in that direction to do with war being functional to regime security, aspirationally at least. But as the war began to go catastrophically badly, Putin was forced into more types of reformatting of the regime, not just totalitarian turns, but other kind of reformatting than he would have liked, right? So it's a guy or a team that decided to go off-road, right, as a way of keeping everybody in the bus in check. But they've gone deeper off-road than they wanted, and they face various kinds of risks of getting stuck in the mud, which could conceivably leave them in a worse place than would have been the case if they'd stayed on the road. Now, one of the obvious kinds of reformatting that we talked about is how Russia changed from being an informational autocracy, whereby politics is desired that is about maximally controlling the information environment. And what matters is controlling that rather than reality. And that meant not doing things that would create realities so obstinate that they would not allow the informational environment to be managed. And Putin thought that this management would be possible if his operation lasted 3 days or 7 days or 2 weeks. But that proved impossible in practice. And the regime had to reformat itself, right, in a more tyrannical direction, more rapidly than it wanted. And it's going to have to keep doing this. And it's going to have to keep doing this more and more and more. And it is doing it intentionally, but reluctantly. So that's a little bit how we might think about not the totalitarian turns Russia's already taken, but the ones it will yet inevitably take over the months, if not years to come. But there have been other kinds of reformatting of the state that have been forced on the regime. And one of them has been this extraordinary loosening of certain institutions. One of them is the institution of, let's put it like this, whatever is the institutional basis for the state's monopoly of organized violence. Now, Russia never had complete monopoly of organized violence the way other states do, right? I mean, Moscow didn't much control what happened in Chechnya, for example. But there's no comparison between where Russia was then and where Russia is now. The state has given up, to quite a large degree, elements of its monopoly of organized violence. And perhaps the most glaring example of this was Mr. Prigozhin being allowed, as he was then but isn't now, to go around prisons and pick people up from prisons for his so-called private military company. So these kinds of adjustments will continue, and what we need to watch for through them is the stability of the regime. And this is hard to watch for because these regimes are spectacularly untransparent. I mean, I can tell you exactly how stable Rishi Sunak's government is, but I can't tell you exactly, because nobody can, how stable a fairly obscure tyranny is. Nevertheless, we can do some sort of basic functional reflection, and then we can do some more intuitive reflection. Let's do a couple of basic functional remarks. Does Putin want Mr. Prigozhin to go around and scream vitriol every single day in the direction of the Ministry of Defense? Under ideal conditions, obviously no. But under the conditions of war and war going badly, he does need, or has so far needed, Mr. Prigozhin. Is it also possible that Mr. Putin needs Mr. Prigozhin to sustain a conflict with the Ministry of Defense because that's advantageous to Putin's triangulation of the different pillars of power in his court, in his regime? Yeah, it's very important to keep the army, it's been very important historically for the Putin regime to keep the army away from political power. So partly the Russian military's weakness is functional, it's a feature, not just a bug. And it may be that weakening the political power of the military is helpful for Mr. Putin, right? So we can speculate about all these things and then wonder, well, at what point is something like Mr. Prigozhin's business going to become more of a hindrance than a help? And will the Putin regime be able to control things, right? To remove it at that stage without it being too late for him to remove it and so on. So that's, I think, just a little bit of the basic functional reflection on this. As we watch this, I think a good tip is, this actually was said by a Russian political scientist, Katerina Schulman. Some of you have asked me what I think about her, and I couldn't answer because I haven't watched anything she said for the last 6 months. I've watched a couple of her recent interventions in Russian, just as I was at the beach. Well, I wasn't much at the beach, I was mostly in bed, but just as I was at the beach. and I liked very much what she said. However, that doesn't mean that the quality is exactly the same when she speaks in English, because she's a real sense of what matters and what doesn't, what matters to the Russian audience she's speaking to, Russian-speaking audience she's speaking to. But one of the things she said is most people mistake things that cause indignation for things that have significance. And I would actually add to that, most people mistake things that induce humorous response for things that have significance. In other words, when we see the Russians showing bewildering incompetence and disorganization, we might think, oh, that's significant in the sense that that surely means the Putin regime is going to collapse, right? Or when we see something farcical happening in the Russian economy, we might say, oh, that surely means Russia is going to collapse economically. Or when we see the Putin regime doing terrible things, saying terrible things, we say, oh, surely that can't last. But there's a risk in these kinds of reactions of confusing both indignation but also humor with significance. And significance is really about whether something has happened, right? Or whether there is a new stage in an old process or a new process that changes the regime's stability, because that is in the end what we're watching for. And when we do these talks, part of the things that one of the things that we care about is the stability of the regime compared to a month ago, compared to 3 months ago, and our projection of that stability. I mean, that's much of what you care about when it comes to Russia. So it's important to watch that soberly, and this sort of drama is a bit of a window, or at least an invitation for us into making an analysis of where this gradation of stability is at today. Now, this video is going to be special because I'm going to read a comment from a viewer, and this is a new thing we'll try a couple of times and see what we make of it. And the point isn't that I read the comment and I respond to it. I could just do that in the comment, but that I respond to a comment. And this one is going to be about how to politicize the Russian space post-Putin. Is that in responding to the comment, we can experience a kind of demonstration of how to approach content you consume, including this content, as well as a demonstration of not just what, but how to think about some of the issues we're facing. So I'm going to get the question, be back in a second. We are back. Let me tell you why I picked this question. I clicked on the question, which is from Stephen. Hi, Stephen. And I noticed that Stephen has been following the channel for a long time, or the channels, and has left a lot of comments. And he didn't have a clear memory of responding to Stephen, and there was like 50 comments there. That's unusual, because if you've commented 50 times on my videos, the chances are we've interacted. So because of that, I felt to give that question some space, but this answer isn't for Stephen, I'm afraid. It's for the community, but with respect for Stephen, so we're not just exploiting his question as a prop. And it's a long one, and I'll just put it up here. Vlad, I watch your podcasts. I don't know whether you read any comments or if you reply. If not, this is sad. I reply probably a bit more than most YouTubers doing what I do. I think quite a bit more. But I think that if you take into account my illness, that I only work about 3 hours a day, then I reply a disproportionately high amount. Well, at the same time, also, of course, keeping a lot of people waiting in a way I wish I hadn't. and keeping a lot of people without a reply, because if I had more time, I'd use it to interact with the community more. And that's in a way the point of this channel. I mean, this channel, the chat channel, is about depth of community. It's not about growing. This channel doesn't grow. It only grows because some people come over from the main channel. And, I make about 20 videos here per one on the main channel. Balance needs to be reflected a bit upon, but that's where we are. So that's a belief of mine about how certain kinds of questioning are best done as part of a conversation. Your latest video has several uncharacteristic flaws. Let me detail these in case I misunderstand your points. First, the West needs to give Russians ideas, visions for a post-Putin Russia. That presumably is what I said. I'm assuming you expect your Western liberal leftist friends, Stephen, I'm joking, it's okay, to articulate such a future. Now, interestingly, I in sort of print, let's say, that's different to a YouTube comment, would recommend to not use tags like that, because, for example, when I say liberal, I don't mean anything ideological. I mean elections, courts, right? Change of power, counter-majoritarian institutions. And then further nuances, for example, about my own position politically, are available on the philosophy channel. And it's called, there's a video there called something like What's Vlad's Politics. But, and this is really important, YouTube comments are essentially, in most cases, to be thought of as casual things people say. I think that's really, really important. And I think quite a few content creators who are insecure suffer from not understanding quite how much that is so. They make a video and so somebody says, I hate this video. And the content creator replies, what is wrong with you? Why would you just say that? And then the commenter replies, oh, love your content, actually. This one didn't work much for me. So you see, if the reply was, instead of what is wrong with you or bugger off, thanks for watching or love your feedback, then that second comment would have come more naturally, and that immediately revealed that the first comment wasn't what the content creator thought it was. So that's important. So that's why these labels are okay in YouTube comments. That these people, we're back now, Western liberal leftist friends of Vlad's, cannot do this for flyover America. How on earth are they going to do that for Russia, basically? Now, I want to stay with that because I want to say a couple of things, I reckon, about it. But let me just say the first. That's not the point that I'm making. And I think that's not the point I'm making in that video that you're responding to. I'm saying two things. We need to understand the post-Putin scenarios on the Russian space, and we need to incentivize those scenarios which are to our advantage. Russia went through a kind of imposition / self-imposition of a Western theory of modernization in the early 90s. And Russia has a kind of historical bitterness and trauma about that experience. That stuff doesn't work. That stuff is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is us simply doing what we can by politicizing the Russian space with a set of clarifications and expectations about where we stand. For example, want negotiations with us, Russians? Get out of Ukraine all the way. pay reparations, and release your political prisoners, increase the list. Want more than just negotiations? Do these three other things, right? That is politicization. It's getting politically involved, right? Not just being observers. And via that, increasing the odds that folks on the Russian space are going to think of their future in terms of alternatives they can contrast and compare and work out. 2, intellectual Russians do not have roots in society. I think that's a fair generalization, Stephen. I reckon you're right. They fled as soon as the wind changed. Well, they were going to go to prison if they were going to keep talking openly and forcefully. Do they have any real standing with any people groups? I think that among the Russian opposition, Mr. Navalny's group does break out of, urban Moscow demographics. And it did that historically via its anti-corruption message. Because the anti-corruption message could get through to just about anybody, even somebody who was in love with Putin's foreign policy. The problem now is that there is a question about the efficacy of the anti-corruption model. In other words, can there be an organization, and I don't want to legislate on this now, which focuses its anti-regime activity on corruption by revealing, I suppose, not just that the Putin regime is bad ethically, but that they're bad, as in bad at doing anything that they themselves on their terms want to do. You see, at this point, the preponderance of the Russian oppositional messaging needs to be about Russians choosing a different future to Putin and stopping the war. That's a conversation for another time, but I think roughly you're right. And then you add some more points. You say that Muslim Russia might have a future outside the Russian Federation if a kind of confederation of Central Asian states organized as a primitive EU. I'm going to simply leave that out because my conversation is about what we in the West can do today, like literally today or next week, to politicize the post-Putin space. Mr. Dugin, right, hard radicals are doing that already in Russia. We need to do it too, because we need to bring it about that whatever happens on the Russian space is in our interests. Russians, ethnic Russians, you say, have a big Soviet era generational gap. This generational gap may need 10 to 20 years for the last Soviet folks to pass. I think that's also a fair point, Stephen. What I would say, though, is that there is a risk of a skipped generation whereby the last of the Soviet generations passes on, the next generation has a kind of a healthy skepticism of the Soviet order, but the generation after, a generation that has absolutely zero sense of what the Soviet project was really like, then gets romantic about it again. And that's partly what Putin is trying to recreate with this sort of extraordinary infusion of propaganda into the education system today. Now, Putin is not in love with the Soviet Union. This doesn't have a communist bone in his body, really, but he is in love with the Soviet Union as one expression among others of the Russian Empire. Number 3, can Russia be destabilized without China getting involved? Not my lane, but the distinction I would make there is that China's capacity to influence what happens on the bits of the Russian space, at least, may be sufficient so that They don't need to do anything more. 4, baby steps often get things going. For example, solidarity in Poland was a small step toward toppling the Soviet Union. Would a post-Putin Russia allow a Belarus uprising like Ukraine's Maidan revolution? I think that's a cross-categorization. So the Maidan is very much unlike the Belarus uprising in 2020. And the Belarus uprising in 2020 is quite unlike anything that might happen in Russia today. Why is that? Because you're talking about different political systems. Maidan time, the political system is divided, there is conflict. When you're out on the street, there are folks who want to stamp down on you, but there are also folks with power who are on your side, right? That is a completely different scenario, right? Where the political system there is conflictive and itself politicized, right, with what's going on the street. So you're not going against the wall, you're going against a power elite that is itself in a conflict about the issue that you are marching about. So that is different to what happened in Belarus in 2020, right? So you can label Maidan as the enterprise of stopping the early signs of an authoritarian regime. Belarus is not early signs, it's rather taking on a fully established authoritarian regime that has a very good vertical hold over the country, or at least had a good vertical hold over the country, and is beginning to reach the end of its life, unless it's put on Kremlin-driven life support. And that is perhaps easier than taking on a regime that is a tyranny in sort of in a fully healthy mode. But it's hugely and incomparably more difficult than Maidan. There's no comparison. And the Putin regime today is not in the kind of decline, right, in terms of its hold over power, at least not now, not this month, not this moment. It's not in the kind of decline that the Lukashenko regime is in and was in 2020. These are quite different political scenarios, and that's why it's no good to name 7 different countries and say, oh, why aren't people protesting there? Or why are people protesting? They're different scenarios, right? And it's a different thing, challenging sort of incrementally onsetting tyranny versus challenging an established tyranny versus challenging an established tyranny in decline, and so on. And then Stephen added a note about his admirable career in the military and his admirable civilian career. But I'm going to say something, although I'll say it a bit differently than if Stephen were a 22-year-old kid, again about this early point that you make about how I said that the West needs to give Russians ideas and visions for a post-Putin future. Let's put 2 things alongside each other. We need to understand what might happen on the post-Putin space, and we need to begin incentivizing the outcome we want, and we need to begin doing all we can to politicize that space so there is conflict on it and a perception of choices and possibilities, right? Something like that. And then your version is Vlad expects his elite Western leftist liberal friends to articulate such a future. for Russia, to articulate visions and ideas for a post-Putin Russia. Now you see the difference. It's not just a difference of sense, it's also a difference of sensibility. It's a completely different sentiment that is behind what I say versus what you say, I say. And so this is a little bit you breaking that habituation of holding on a bit longer and checking if you're not in fact hearing what you want to hear as opposed to what is actually being said, methinks. I'm not going to give you a lesson about that because you're not a 22-year-old kid. But I think that's an interesting illustration for us all. And I'm sure I've been guilty of it. In fact, I can think right now of a moment when I was guilty of it, where I jumped on something. A couple of colleagues did an academic piece, and I read it partially and too quickly, and I imagined that something was in there that there wasn't, and I looked at it again and I realized that I jumped the gun. So that I think that is very, very important, because it goes to the heart of how we read, how we listen, how we do all we do. Battle brain fog a bit during all of this. That is why sometimes you heard words that barely made sense. There were a few minutes in this where there were words that barely made sense, and you had to sit there and say, why is he just using words to fill up space? I was using words to fill up space because my brain was not working. So let's love. Talk very soon.